So I'm delighted to be here. I'm sure we have hundreds and thousands of listeners or viewers.
Viewers.
My name is Edward Sullivan. I am professor of art history at NYU and a curator, and I'm one of the three curators of the exhibition called El Dorado: Myths of Gold. The exhibition has been in two parts. The first part opened in September and closed in December, and the second part opened last month, January, and closes on May 18th. So those of you in or near New York or who are traveling to New York, please try to come to the America Society on Park Avenue and 68th Street and see an exhibition on which we have been working. My two colleagues, Aimee Iglesias Lucan and Tie Jojima, have been working, and I've been working with them for approximately 3 years for an exhibition that is part of a three-part effort, an international effort that was in the Fundación Proa in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and ours is now on, and part three will be at the Amparo Museum, the Museo Amparo in Puebla, Mexico, beginning in August. Each of the three exhibitions has the same title, the same ideas, the concepts of what is gold in the Americas. It is not a history of gold, but rather it asks us questions. The works of art ask questions of each other. And it is really an inquiry into many different issues, aesthetic issues and social, political issues about colonialism, extractivism, many historical ideas. That sounds all very brainy, but it's a beautiful show as well. And I have the huge privilege of having in the studio, which is part of the public programs that we are organizing for the exhibition, two of the artists who are in the part two. Karen Lofgren is with us here. She was in part one and she's in part two. And Vicente Telles is here, and his work is also shown in the exhibition, and I'll show some images of it. So the two artists are two people whose work I admire. I only actually got to know them in person, virtually, very recently, and I'm delighted that we'll be able to share with you some of their ideas. But what I think I'm going to do at the very beginning, and let me also interject myself by saying that you can leave questions on the comment section, which you have in your on Instagram, and this will also be put onto the website of the America Society. So if you want your friends or your mother or somebody to see it, you'll be able to tell them it's on the website. So what I think I'll do is just very informally, this is going to be a very informal conversation, and I had first thought that the two artists could present their work, but I'm just going to say a few words about it and about them and about their work, and then we can get right to our conversation. So I think that would be sort of more fun and more informal. So Karen, I'll say a few words about Karen, who's a Canadian, Los Angeles-based artist. She has her MA from Cal Arts, and she has won all sorts of fellowships, from the Fulbright to the Guggenheim to Canada Council fellowships, and she is also the product of many places where she's lived. We had this really great conversation the other day, just as to get to know each other, and I was so interested in her talking, and we'll hear a bit more about her life in places like Lima and Iquitos, Peru, and in London. And so she is a peripatetic artist. She has shown in many different venues, and a great deal of her work I think could be described as sensitivity to nature, to healing processes. We talked the other day about her eco-feminist viewpoint that comes up in the work, and also the work that grows out of her interest in living with, talking to indigenous groups, particularly in Peru and elsewhere, connects her with things that are outside of the so-called normal art world. So it is a practice, as we'll see in a couple of moments. Let me just show you the first image that we see here in the on the I guess you can see it on the upper left. I'm not quite sure how this goes, but Karen has several pieces that filter into the gallery. So the gallery is all about, as I said before, the exhibition in the gallery of America Society is about gold and how we react to it. And among the pieces are this work that creates a sense of the weaving of gold into our present. I think we have another. Can we see another? Can I just go to that myself? Okay. Oh, so that's fine. Here. So this is called Gold Flood. And so these are two pieces that Karen did for the exhibition. Vicente is a Santero. The word Santero comes from the word santo, which in art historical terms or in artistic terms means the painter of saints or painter of religious subjects. The history of painting in New Mexico, which was part of the northern frontier of the Spanish lands when Spain was the colonial overlord, I guess you could say, of much of the New World. The traditions that Vicente grows out of are those that had appeared in all throughout the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking parts of Latin America, but had a particular strength and particular meaning in New Mexico. And here is the piece that is of Vicente's work in the exhibition, and the title is Nuestra Señora de Samajo, if I pronounce that correctly, or Chimayo. Chimayo is a mission near Santa Fe, and much painted by Georgia O'Keeffe, if you know her work. But this particular work, let me just go to the next image, is a sort of contemporary riff on a well-known composition, which is that it's an 18th century painting of the Virgin of Potosi in Bolivia. So the imagery in the viceregal or colonial period was very fluid. And so an image from Bolivia will have an afterlife in the work of Vicente himself. He is also in the line of and creates work that was inspired by some of the famous santeros of the 19th century in New Mexico, like José Rafael Aragon. And the next, if we can go to the next image, and this is a work by José Rafael Aragon from the 19th century. And then the next one shows us a more famous image that was also done very much by New Mexican santeros and by Vicente, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And that, just to give you a little bit of a background of the type of work that these artists do. And let me just show you a couple of pieces by Karen, and then I'll stop blabbing on and turn the microphone over to my two friends. Karen is, as I said, an artist who is deeply in touch with nature, and her paintings and her installations and her individual sculptures, to a great extent, have to do with, for example, if we just are looking at a few instances here, we can see that in this one that you just saw a moment ago, I see you like this. I see you in dreams. This is a part of a larger body of work that derives from Amazonian medicinal plant leaves. The inspiration is from this. Actually, a lot of the work of Karen can be seen in a spectacular book that was very recently published, and it's called Embrujada: Charms for the Living, and it is a compendium of her work, of photographs of her work. It is available in the United States because it's distributed by DAP, and there is the if you hold it up, because it's a beautiful book, and that is a great way to get to know the art of Karen. So let's just flip through two or three more of these images showing, for example, the work that is in Embrujada, and a couple of more, and then I will let them talk. I also wanted to mention that Vicente, and let's see if we can get one more of Karen's work, and then we have a couple of works by Vicente. Here is Fear Extinction by Karen from 2023, and then if we go, please, someone else in another room is doing the slides, and usually in my own classes I'm the master of technology, but here we have two people doing it. Oh, and then Karen is pointing to the piece that we just saw. So back to Vicente, and his work. I wanted very much to point out. If we go to his self-portrait, can we just go back one to Vicente's self-portrait? There you are, and this is a self-portrait, and it's important to know that all of his work is done with very traditional vegetal materials, and we'll discuss that in a second. And let's just see two or three other examples of the type of work that Vicente does. He has a body of work that is called traditional santos, that really play off the 19th century, 18th and 19th century santos tradition. And then he has, if we can go forward, please, a couple of examples of contemporary, where he takes ancient or colonial themes and does his own variations upon them. And let's have one more of Vicente's pieces. And you can see here, for example, that this is definitely a contemporary take, simply called Mujer, or Woman, from 2019, but using some of the same type of flat color that's very characteristic of 19th century Santos in New Mexico. But here we have a play between 2 and 3 dimensions, because it is also a three-dimensional frame. One more thing I want to say about Vicente is that he's also a curator. And there was a recent exhibition that has been in both Albuquerque and San Diego, called De Aquí y Son de Aquí y Son de Allá. They are from here, they are from there, which includes 10 artists from Texas, Mexico, Arizona, and California. So he is very much of a multitasker, and the job of curating, as I know very well, because I am a professor, but I'm also a curator, is very, very taxing. So with that, let's let me go back to the piece that is right behind Karen. And maybe Karen and Vicente, you could just say hello and a couple of words that you might think either I messed up in my description of your art, or anything you might particularly want to say. Oh, that's actually right behind Karen for, yeah, not, this is, the slides have a mind of their own. So let's go back to, if you can, where is that? No, I'm trying to find the piece that is behind Karen as we see her in her studio. Right there, perfect. And it is called Fear Extinction, as I said earlier. So, Karen, just hello to you. Vicente, hello to you. Why don't you just say hi to the audience, and maybe say a few words about the images that we've seen, and then I'll start asking you questions, and we'll go on from there.
Vicente, do you want me to talk first? I can say hello to everyone. Hi.
Yeah,
and
please do.
Hi, Vicente. It's very good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm really excited to be in this exhibition, the El Dorado Miss of Gold show. It includes this work, which I first developed in 2009 as a very large installation. And I feel like that work is remaining and increasing in its sort of cultural relevancy over time, as the pressures and urgency of anti-extractivist activism develops globally in order to attempt to meet the need of the moment and of all species for us to begin to protect the earth rather than to see the earth as a source of wealth to be removed at all costs. And I think it's quite salient, this El Dorado Miss of Gold. Also, there's this quote I remember referencing very early in this gold flood thing. I made a little publication with quotes about gold. And there was one I recall, and I'll paraphrase Christopher Columbus: "Should I meet with gold and spices in any great quantity, there I shall remain until I collect as much as possible." And here we find ourselves today, in this extractivist nightmare where the forests and in the north and in the south are getting plundered for this material that has no innate value outside of its perceived scarcity.
Right. Thank you. Let's go to the self-portrait of Vicente. And Vicente, hello.
Hello, how's it going? First off, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank you, Edward, Chia, May, for allowing me to participate in the show. And I'm thankful that, we're here talking, and, hopefully we can have some fun, good conversation and, see what happens from these interactions.
I actually looking at you in this self-portrait, which has you can correct me, but my impression, I've not seen the original, but you appear to us as a Spanish grandee in a way.
Yeah, so
you might.
For me, being here in New Mexico, there's, a lot of us come from a varied, I guess, background, and, the idea of these 23andMe and these people taking, these tests to see who they are. So for me, I try to break this self-portrait down as me being present, the past, and so it's like broken down in little elements of what makes who I am, starting with the hat, it's with the broad-billed hat, I come from an agricultural family, and, and that sweat that's along the base of that is, for me, like how I grew up, and thinking about the hat band is, a Greek symbol. My grandfather was a Griego, and, and so it's like, so from that design and the hat band to the Spanish collar to my current sweater, that says cultura on it to the idea of some of my indigenous ancestors with the shell, the African beads, the tehelet, the Jewish tehelet, the African kind of fabric hanging off the corner. All those bits make who I am, and that's how I want to express myself, and the understanding of who I am as a person and try to put it into paint.
Right. I think that's a very, very important point, that in both of your work, although they're very, very different, they both speak to a rootedness, speak to a great sensitivity to either historic past that you know about, in the case of Vicente, your family, and in the case of Karen's work, which is just behind you so we can see it, the idea of rootedness literally into with nature. So I'm quite fascinated by the combination of world views, if you want to say that you have and that you were able to translate into your work. So, Karen, would you say that this sort of transcendental or quasi-magical idea or feeling or aura that we get when we're in front of your works is something that comes at least partly from your experience in the Amazon?
I, I don't know. Not the works in the exhibition. These were made 15 years ago. Although, I mean, I'm a forest person. I really am. So the forests of the world speak to me in a very deep way. And like massive, extremely wet, like rainforest, like the northern rainforest in British Columbia as well, speaks to me in equal volumes as the rainforests of the south. So I'm very much a forest person. I'm also a gardener. So I've been a gardener for my entire life since I was born. I think I planted my first garden by myself, like dug up the earth and planted the seeds and planted starts when I was maybe about 7 years old. So I've always been a plant person. So I speak to plants. I learned how to speak to plants. My mother was an animist. I grew up Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, and so I found that I had a lot in common with other animist people with animist backgrounds in their cultures, and in a number of instances had very easy dialogues with indigenous people in my life that shared that animist perspective and background. So it's like a non-anthropocentric way of interacting with the world, where it's not just our species that is under consideration as a speaker or as a listener.
Right. Actually, I'm fascinated that you brought up the West Coast, Canadian West Coast forests, rainforests, and animism, because even though your work doesn't remind me visually, the spirit of it reminds me a great deal of that of Emily Carr. And Emily Carr is, for those of you who don't know her work, she's one of the great artists of the America as well, of the early 20th century, who in much of her art, and she grew up and all of her work was done in British Columbia, and it was the forests and the myths and the legends of First Peoples in Western Canada that were at the root of her art. And so even though your two bodies of work don't look anything like each other, it is I think for me as an art historian, I immediately think of precedents in the past of who your spiritual interlocutors were. And I don't know if you ever thought about that type of relationship to Emily Carr, who's so famous in the history of modernism in Canada, but that certainly came into my mind. And speaking of the past, Vicente, I'm really interested in how you got to become a painter of Santos or Santero, and just talk to us a little bit about your development in that way.
Yeah, so it kind of happened on like a whim. I was in one of my classes and in college, a Chicano studies class, and one of the professors made an offhanded comment about, everybody in New Mexico knows what a Navajo silversmith or a New Mexico Santero is, and how the tourism comes here and the people that tourism brings don't really acknowledge the people outside of their perceived kind of value, right? Like, so I didn't know what a Santero was, and so I took the time to go read some books and kind of stumbled upon the artwork, and the artwork kind of resonated with me. Before I wasn't really doing anything creative or painting or nothing, and the artwork just kind of stuck with me. And as I started to read, I started to understand or started to realize what kind of cultural grounding in the arts that is for me. This is something that the classic Santeros, the Jose Rafael Aragons, the Moyenos, the Laguna Santero, most of them anonymous now because they didn't sign a lot of their work back then. But then you got, Jose Manuel Benavides all the way up into current makers now. And the more I read, the more it started to make sense to me as a way to speak of my kind of present using this kind of iconography of the New Mexico Santo. So, there's quite a bit of, creators now that are phenomenal still carrying the tradition. And I just feel like, I have to do my part to be, a good representation and somebody who really respects kind of the art form. And, it's the past in a sense, but it's also me. It's the present.
Do you think,
And
Vicente, when you're making santeros, you're also making in parallel these very like contemporary politically motivated and very very distinct paintings in concert with the santos. Do you think that for people who are not art audiences, the santos gives them a doorway, gives them like a portal into the language of contemporary art?
I think so. I guess I view, there's a very limited view that has been persistent about the New Mexico Santos and the idea of this isolation and creation. Having a conversation with one of my good buddies about the paradox of isolation, and thinking about the old Santos and the classic Santero art. We're painting the kings and queens, and for me, I see that as political propaganda. I don't want to take away from the fact that there's a lot of creators who this is a very deep and religious and held belief. Where I'm coming from is looking at it as a cultural idea and how to mend my present to the past and create a future through the present, and using the idea of propaganda, as much religious art is, and kind of reworking the idea and this language that people can already understand in the Santo or religious, and kind of making that iconography into what I believe that people need to be aware of today. So it's kind of just remixing it and thinking about our life and the empathy that, some art has, a story to tell and teach, and some art doesn't. And I happen to participate in an art where I feel like I can use my voice to even preach to the choir, sort of say.
I you mentioned, Vicente, the word isolation. And I always, in my many interviews with artists, friends of mine, and people who I admire, I'm always interested to know how the act of creation of a visual, something visual, which is really a lonely, isolating, or isolationist thing. You work by yourself in the studio, usually. I mean, there are obviously many artists who work in groups and so on. But I'm very interested these days in asking artists who I know, how did you spend the pandemic, and how was your experience of isolating Was it a transformative experience? Did your work change? Did you get more intense in your thinking about the subjects that you had treated, either figuratively or abstractly? I think it's a really interesting question, because everyone that I've ever asked it to has fascinating insights into what happened. So, Karen, could you tell us a little bit about how you spent that time? Or maybe you weren't even here. I don't know.
I was here. I was in Los Angeles for the entire pandemic.
uh,
Oh no, not true. I was in Canada as well sometimes, and in Europe a little bit, but mostly I was in Los Angeles in my house. And so, well, I don't want to get too much into it, but I got pretty sick during the pandemic with some bone diseases. So I had some sort of another carapace of isolation on top of the actual pandemic. Was I was going through some very serious health crises and had to have multiple operations. So most of my pandemic was spent in recovery and also developing new works and working towards this book. So I was writing and editing this book, and then working with the authors, who are really wonderful, who are in the book, on continued dialogues of the subjects we had been mostly talking about at that point for years. So those dialogues continued to develop in a really salient way throughout the pandemic, even though, and maybe because, I was so sick. You know, I needed distractions. I needed to be productive. I was also completing my, beginning my, it was during my Guggenheim years too, which was 21 and 22. So this was like my big overarching project, was to, well, two things: finish the book, publish the book, and get better.
and the book is a compendium of some of the most important pieces that you've done over your career. Is that correct?
I mean, it's mostly it mostly just covers like the past 5 or 6 years, and it's mostly just work that's related in a quite immediate way to this overarching series called "What is to Cure."
Mm-hmm. The idea of curing, and curing can take so many different forms. And I gathered that in your case, doing this book, imagining what was going to be in it and how you are presenting yourself in the work, that was part of a curative process. Does that seem to be?
In a way, it was something of an exorcism, I suppose, right?
Right.
But I started this series about curses and cures for curses when I was on a Fulbright, and I'm not like trying to do that to drop names, but that I was studying. My proposal specifically was to study the history of ancient medicine with a focus on ritual plant medicine in the global north, because I had some sensibility of the way that this is practiced in other animist cultures, and has been since time immemorial, since our species began to bury our dead, you know, which was quite a long time ago now. So I started developing the body of work during that period, and during a residency also in Peru, which was like around 2017, 2018. So it's works really from then to the present that are really part of this body of work. That said, to mention, I didn't consciously know I was ill when I began.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And in terms of healing, curanderos, play a very important role in many, many places in the world, the global South, but particularly in the Americas and in New Mexico. So, Vicente, you some of your work has to do with this subject, and not necessarily directly, but at least indirectly. And I just wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how a theme like curing, or a theme like magic, or a theme like spirituality finds its way into your work. I mean, I see it in every single piece that I've had the pleasure of looking at. But maybe talking to us a little bit about it will enlighten our audience.
Well, I'm kind of biased about where I come from in New Mexico. I think this is the most magical place on earth. So just with that said, you know, during the pandemic is going, collecting some pigments. One pigment I really like to use is micaceous clay, which gives a little bit of glimmer with that mica flake. So, thinking about, being isolated, this piece that's currently being shown, that piece came out of the pandemic, or because of the pandemic. It was a collaboration between myself and my good friend, Brandon Maldonado. I had a studio near his house. We talked about this project of making this idea of, the both sides of the coin, right? Those who consider themselves Mexica and those who consider themselves Spanish, and really kind of how do we dissect, and we're in the middle of that. So with that in mind, thinking about the magic and growing up in New Mexico, a lot of the door jambs and the window sills are painted blue and turquoise. Well, for me, I grew up with that and not really understanding as a kid, but it was part of my everyday occurrence. But later, as I'm reading, that was to ward off bad energy, bad spirits, and something that's both in the native, stuff, and then the Hispano ideology. Is there something that I always grew up not understanding, but being aware of. So with my work, I try and use that idea of those kind of colors and those kind of, ideas of existence. And, in a lot of my paintings, there's a little piece of New Mexico in it. That is the land of New Mexico in some of these paintings. So, with the pandemic, it allowed me to explore outside of painting just Santos. I had a real rigorous schedule of I had to make these shows. So that the self-portrait that you showed, that was one of my first attempts at trying to do kind of a more dimensional idea, a little more, conventional painting, but still using, some forged natural pigments, but the majority of, watercolors. So with the homemade gesso, just like the Santos are painted. So I'm still trying to use the limitations of the materials that are part of the tradition in the Santos and kind of put it into my paintings that are non-religious, or not religious forward, I should say.
I have made many trips to New Mexico, and I absolutely agree with you about its magical qualities. So I don't think that what you are doing is necessarily making it up, because you're living it. And there's a very spiritual sense to that type of connection with the past. And I also sense, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, there seems to be a sense of family. There's maybe not necessarily your family, but the connection that families have to their past generations and past generations before that. I sense that that is a very important idea that you are working with.
Absolutely. There's a joke here that if you've been here for long enough, you're probably cousins. Everybody here is related somehow. So, that is a very major part of me growing up, was taking a trip with my grandma from Albuquerque to where she grew up south of Albuquerque, about an hour. And that taking 8 hours to get to a place that's an hour away, because we stopped at every single cousin, every single person that she probably ever knew going down there. So with that, all those experiences of going into this home in the middle of the summer, adobe home, and the older woman cranking their stove up to, it felt like 1,000 degrees. So all those little ideas of seeing these, in one of the pieces that you have is a cobija, these blankets that were omnipresent in my childhood. There is across many cultures with the idea of the quilt. And it's a lot of my work is with that in mind. How do I connect to those who have been misplaced from New Mexico, moved away from New Mexico, and how do I acknowledge that they're out there?
So, Karen, Vicente is very anchored in one place. You have have spent time in the eastern part of Canada and the western part, in California, in Peru, and elsewhere. So, can you articulate how, if you do indeed, how you sense that in your work you put together the inspiration from different geographical locations?
Oh, that's for me, rootedness is an interesting phenomenon, right? Like that you become this tortoise, you know, you're carrying home and finding it where you go. And usually where I'm finding it is like in the land and in the dirt and in the with the plants and the animals of the place and listening to the cultures that are indigenous to those places, regardless of where that is, and to uh, begin to develop an understanding of the specificity of that place. And when I say that, I mean like, so I make gardens everywhere I go, pretty much. Everywhere I'm able to, I do usually establish a medicinal plant garden pretty quickly. I've been doing that. I think I moved out of home when I was 17 and I had my first like St. John's wort growing and pennyroyal and things like this within maybe, I don't know, 6 months. You know, I was like the only 17-year-old with a shovel and a hose that I knew that I would bring around to different places. So it's mostly through the language of the way that that things grow in the place and yeah, it's specificity. So like any like with my plants, for example, I plant the same species in like 4 different locations, and the species it will pick where it wants to thrive. It will harness the resources that it needs in order to thrive in that place. And I guess I have become in many ways somewhat transient, although I do have a very solid home background in on Toronto Island, which is like it's a small island just out of downtown Toronto. So that's it's like a rural slash urban background, which is already very split, right? Very urban culture in a very rural setting.
Right.
So
I should remind our audience that if you want to make a comment or question, ask a question, you can put it in the comment feature in on your phones. But I was delighted to hear you say your history with gardens, Karen, because it is one of my passions. I'm not a gardener, although I have worked. I several years ago, I did an exhibition, and it was real privilege to do an exhibition at the New York Botanical Garden. And it was part of part of a large exhibition that was centered around the Brazilian garden architect Roberto Burle Marx, who had a very long life, and he died in 1994. But traveling to his extraordinary gardens of his own home outside of Rio and many other places in Brazil and elsewhere, where he created a it's really an aura. It's a garden, but a garden is a work of art in itself, and a garden is a place of respite, and a garden is a place of learning, and a garden is a place for, potentially for curing. And I think that not all that many people realize this, and so I love the idea that for you, creating a garden when you were 17 years old and continuing to do it in the various places you've lived has been among the most significant inspirations for you. And do you see in the work that you produce, particularly in large installation pieces, that plant life becomes one of the central concerns of your of your work?
often for the past many years, yes, absolutely. It's been very much at the center of this sort of a picking apart of Western epistemologies and this brutal, strict, linear system of knowledge doesn't embrace holistic cosmologies, which encompass really most of the world, you know. So what ends up happening is, like, we have in the Westerners end up with a very limited understanding of what is really going on, what the bigger picture is, because our capacity to study it is so limited by this a type of narrow exactitude, which doesn't encompass enough ways of knowing.
Yeah. And in a similar vein, Vicente, your work is always done with natural elements, and you were speaking very briefly a little while ago about the pigments, the gesso,
Mm-hmm.
So on. So could you tell us a little bit more about the pigments and the gesso and various other things that you use to create your art? And do you make your own paints, or how do you come by them? Or just talk to us a little bit about, I guess what I'm trying to say is the materiality of your work.
Yeah, you know, it's varied within my career. Um, but much like Karen, like when I was really getting into it and, you know, gung ho and really like trying to learn and immerse myself, like, you know, there's, you know, older Santeros who use a lot of forage natural pigments, you know, clays from Abiquiu, you know, different mineral deposits, which they turn into paints. I did more of that when I was, you know, a little bit back in the day, but now I'm set on two colors that I really try to incorporate. And one is a micaceous clay found in northern New Mexico, which I turn into a pigment and use for a sheen. And another one is what we called Santiago green or Placitas green. It's this iron oxide-ish color, a mossy green that, you know, make into a pigment and use it. But now, you know, as I've gotten larger in scale, like I have to leave it to the professionals at Daniel Smith to make me my pigments, use, you know, commercial pigments. But, you know, on top of that, you know, with that surface, which allows me to paint on wood, is that gesso surface, right? The carbon, you know, the calcium bicarbonate, the pottery plaster, the animal hide glue. You know, when I was, you know, previous making pieces, I would cover it with the pinon sap varnish, which is the sap from a pinon tree here in some of the forests here. So much like Karen, like when you're out in the wilderness, like you see the beauty, what potential extraction can, you know, decimate areas. And you know, you start thinking about the land that you're on or that you visit a little bit differently. You know, now I go into the mountains and I'm always looking for a cool color of soil, a cool color of clay, you know, and that, you know, that has allowed me to meet people like, you know, Oaxacan weavers, or we're talking about the indigo dyes, or, you know, it opens up an avenue, a cross-cultural avenue to, you know, talk about these kind of our environment and the clays, the colors, and it becomes something that, you know, it's unexplainable at times, for me. Like I don't often think about using the soil from which, you know, a lot of strife and a lot of beauty have come from in each painting, and it's kind of intense when I start thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that is the feeling that I get from looking at your work. That it is intensity, and it's intense because on one hand, the way you create an image, which is sometimes very almost sculptural, the figures are very outlined. There's a sort of bulkiness to them. And that is something very rooted, literally rooted in the ground. But just as I made the comment to Karen a couple of minutes ago about the artist Emily Carr in the early part of the 20th century, who is in a somewhat similar way reacting to that sense of the earth and sense of the rain and so on and so forth, and the sense of the mythology of the indigenous peoples that she encountered.
May,
Um,
may I mention something about her?
oh, please, yeah.
As an ecologist, she was also witnessing mass deforestation and subjugation of indigenous people that she was around, you know, and I believe, and I'm not 100% sure of the entire story, but she was documenting the rainforest as they were being raided by the lumber companies,
Mm-hmm.
which would
Yeah, that
displace a lot of people.
right.
And I'm not, I want to, I've read the stories. I can't recall the details, so I'll be quiet. But it was from an ecological perspective, it was a conservationist approach to documenting the absolute majesty of the rainforest and the cultures that belong in the
Yeah.
forest as well, and own, or the occupants, you
Of
know.
course, those are very interesting, very important points. And as a corollary to that, I'm thinking of some other artists of the same time of the early 20th century who immersed themselves in the landscape of New Mexico. And of course, the one person who jumps to everybody's mind is George O'Keeffe,
Mhm.
but also is Marston Hartley, an artist who is mostly associated with the East Coast, and then his work in Germany around the right before the beginning of the First World War. But he made a series of landscape pastels in 1926 and the decade before that had this sort of yellowish intensity that
Mhm.
that you know I this might sound crazy, but you mentioned the magic qualities of this place. And having been there on a number of occasions, as I said, I agree with you that there are sometimes places that you go and you just are transfixed and transformed. And that is something that I think that I intuit in your work. So I don't want to say, oh, it's a magical body of work, but it's exudes something like that. Would you say that I was crazy to say that there was some sort of magical aura in the work of both of you? That's why I'm so attracted to it, because I guess I have this streak of philosophical, I don't know, I'm fascinated by things that are magical and spiritual. And I grew up in a very Irish Catholic family. I was an altar boy, so I'm very attracted to that type of religious imagery. And I see in Karen's work this sense of wonderment. And so, would you agree with me, or do you think I'm crazy to say that? Wonderment and magic.
That's I wouldn't disagree, but I've never heard it put that way, but I can understand it.
And Karen, what do you think? I guess I'm looking for positive reinforcement of my wacky idea.
I don't think it's very wacky. I think that a lot of artists, we're really seeking like some kind of self-obliteration into the sublime. I think that's a fairly common wish, you know, for the process of a practice and of building the works, that you're able to listen when you forget yourself.
That was the most beautiful sentence, self-obliteration. In what was the rest of that? I was
In
have to
search of the sublime,
incur
as the process
yeah,
of making work, you know, that you want to listen in a deeper way to what, I mean, our hands know a lot of things. Vicente, certainly, you know, your hands like a concert violinist or something like that. Your hands are going to know what to do much more than you could consciously understand, because the way that we evolved, like biologically and in evolutionary biology, was we absorbed other organisms, right? So all the bacteria, all the viruses that we absorbed in, or that we consumed in order to make ourselves into multicellular beings, they're still in there, you know, and they have something to say that is beyond what we know. And so we're always reaching, I think, for beyond what we know.
I agree, Karen. Like I feel like making art much later in my life, I feel like it was a gift, and at any moment that gift could be taken away. So it's like trying to present it and trying to put as much out there as I can, because as soon as, as quick as it evolved, or it lit that spark, like that spark could go out. So it's maybe it is magic. Like it is like, I can't explain why I chose the path I did.
It's an interesting thought to have chosen it, or did it choose you?
Yeah, don't let my ego say I chose it.
Well,
It chose me.
I think those are both of that back and forth for the past few minutes has been so enlightening to me, and I'm sure to all the people who are listening, because it sounds like a clarification of this aura that you create both in two very different ways with your work, and it's deeply connected to the things around us that we can't see and we can't perceive, and to history way back to the beginnings of time. And not to become too philosophical about it, but I think if we look at works of art with affection, love, and understanding, as much as we can bring to it, and eke out that sense of the spiritual, that is what, for me, successful works of art are, and it is why I am equally attracted to both of your work. And we are here in New York at the American Society extremely privileged to have your pieces as part of our exhibition of El Dorado Myths of Gold. So I see that we've come to our time, and I will thank you profusely and profoundly for your presence and for the wonderful discussion of your art. And I will also encourage everyone who's listening to us to look into your work. You both have very, very beautiful websites that give lots of information, and of course, come to New York, come to Park Avenue and 68th Street, and see the work both of Vicente Telles and Karen Lofgren in person. So thank you very, very much. Mil gracias.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you. That was wonderful. Thanks
Yes.
so much, everybody, for joining us.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. It's an honor.